They found me face down in the snow at the end of my own driveway. I know that's a hard way to start, but if I began anywhere else, if I tried to ease you into this gently, you might not believe what my son was capable of. So let me start there. 71 years old, a retired federal prosecutor with 32 years of service, lying in 6 inches of snow at 10 o'clock at night because my son and his wife had decided I was no longer worth the trouble of keeping alive. That's where this story ends up. Let me tell you how it began. My name is Walter Gaines. I spent my career in the United States Attorney's Office in Charlotte, North Carolina. I put away drug traffickers, corrupt officials, white-collar criminals who thought their money made them untouchable. I believed in the law the way some men believe in God, not blindly but deeply. Completely. I had seen what happened when people thought they were above consequences, and I had dedicated my life to proving them wrong. My wife, Margaret, was an elementary school teacher for 27 years. She was the kind of woman who remembered every student's name, who sent birthday cards to children she had taught a decade earlier. We met in 1979 at a mutual friend's dinner party in Chapel Hill. She laughed at something I said. I cannot even remember what, and I thought, that's it. That's the one. We were married 11 months later. We had one son, Daniel. He was a good boy. I want you to know that before I tell you the rest. He was a curious, kind, sensitive child who used to follow me around the yard on Saturday mornings asking questions about everything: why the grass grew faster near the fence, how the clouds knew when to rain, whether fish dreamed. Margaret used to say he got his heart from her and his stubbornness from me, and she was probably right on both counts. Daniel became an architect. He designed beautiful things, residential homes mostly, a few small commercial buildings. He had a real gift for understanding how people wanted to live inside a space, what made a room feel safe or open or warm. I was proud of him in the uncomplicated way a father can be proud before life gets complicated. Margaret passed away in the spring of 2018, pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end was 4 months and 9 days. I know the exact number because I counted every one of them, desperate to hold on to each hour. She was 66 years old. Daniel was devastated. We both were. But grief does something different to different people. For me, it made me still and quiet. For Daniel, it made him restless, searching. Within 8 months of losing his mother, he had sold his condo in Raleigh, taken on a partner at his firm, and started spending time with a woman named Serena Voss. I met Serena for the first time at a restaurant in Charlotte called the Capitol Grill. Daniel brought her without telling me he was bringing anyone, which I noted but said nothing about. She was 34 to his 43. She was attractive in a very deliberate way, the kind of attractive that takes significant time and investment to achieve and is meant to be noticed. She shook my hand and smiled and said she had heard so much about me. By the end of that dinner, I had a feeling I could not quite name. Not dislike, exactly. Something more like caution. The way I used to feel in a courtroom when a witness answered slightly too smoothly, when the story held together slightly too well. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself I was grieving, and grief makes you suspicious of happiness. I told myself Daniel deserved to move forward. He married her 14 months later. I stood beside him at the ceremony and I smiled, and I meant it, as much as I could. The house became an issue almost immediately. Margaret and I had built our home in 1994 on a 2-acre lot outside of Concord, about 20 minutes from Charlotte. We designed it together. She wanted large windows and a wraparound porch. I wanted a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a room for a proper desk. The builder we hired listened to both of us and gave us something that was entirely ours. We raised Daniel in that house. Margaret planted a garden along the south side that by the time she died had grown into something genuinely beautiful: roses and hydrangeas and a Japanese maple. She had nursed from a 12-inch seedling into a tree that turned copper every October. After she passed, I stayed. Of course I stayed. Every room held her. About 6 months into Daniel's marriage, Serena began making comments about the house. Small things at first. The kitchen was dated. The bathrooms needed updating. The location was inconvenient, too far from the city, too isolated for someone my age living alone. She said these things in a pleasant tone, like she was helping me think through something I hadn't considered. Then the comments shifted. A house this size was a lot to maintain alone. The property taxes had to be significant. Had I thought about downsizing? There were wonderful retirement communities nearby, active living, they called it, like the word retirement was something to be dressed up. She sent me brochures, actual printed brochures, left on the kitchen counter when she and Daniel visited, as though she had simply forgotten them there. I understood what was happening. 32 years as a federal prosecutor means you learn to recognize a campaign when you see one. What I did not yet understand was how far she was willing to take it. In the fall of 2021, Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening. He sounded strange, tense, formal, like he was reading from something he had prepared. He said that he and Serena had been talking. He said they were concerned about me. He said that at my age, living alone in a large house, there were real risks. What if I fell? What if something happened, and no one found me for days? I told him I was in excellent health, which was true. I walked 3 miles every morning. My doctor had told me 6 months earlier that my blood pressure was that of a man 15 years younger. Daniel said health could change quickly. He said he and Serena wanted to help. He said they had found a very nice place in Huntersville, a 1-bedroom apartment in a 55-plus community, and they would help me with the move if I wanted to think about it. I told him I did not want to think about it. There was a silence on the phone. Then he said, in a different tone, quieter, less rehearsed, "Dad, Serena thinks it's the right thing. I want you to understand what those words meant. Not I think, not we think. Serena thinks. I let it go that night. I should not have." Over the next several months, the pressure became less subtle. Daniel stopped coming to visit unless Serena came with him, and Serena spent those visits cataloging the house, looking at the ceilings, examining the floors, opening closets with a kind of quiet inventory that made my skin crawl. She began asking me about my finances, not bluntly, but in the way a skilled manipulator does through concern. Did I have a good financial advisor? Had I updated my estate plan since Margaret passed? It was so important, at my age, to have everything organized. I had, in fact, updated my estate planning thoroughly after Margaret's death. My attorney, a man named Gerald Pittman, who had handled my affairs for 20 years, had helped me put everything in order. The house, my retirement accounts, a modest portfolio, a life insurance policy. Most of it was structured to pass to Daniel upon my death. In January of 2022, someone accessed my online account with the brokerage firm that held my investment portfolio. I did not discover this immediately. The first sign was a letter from my bank about an address change I had not requested. I called them, had it reversed, assumed it was some kind of administrative error. The second sign was a voicemail from Gerald Pittman's office asking me to confirm some instructions they had received. I called back and Gerald told me, carefully and with evident discomfort, that someone had sent a written request to his office, asking about the process for transferring property title, specifically the house. The letter had my name on it. It was not my signature. I went very still on the phone. I had felt this before, not personally, but professionally, in cases where everything you thought was stable suddenly showed its fault lines. That particular stillness, before the full picture comes into focus. I told Gerald to do nothing. I told him I would be in touch. That evening I sat in my library in the chair I had read in for 28 years, under the lamp Margaret had chosen, and I thought about my son. I thought about the boy who asked me why clouds knew when to rain. I thought about the man standing next to me at a cemetery in April of 2018, holding my arm without being asked to. And I thought about Serena Voss, and the way she looked at my house. I did not confront Daniel directly. My instinct, after a lifetime in law, was to gather first. I contacted a private investigator named Roy Clifton, someone I had worked with professionally for years, and I asked him to find out what he could about Serena before Daniel, and specifically her financial history. What Roy found took him 3 weeks and made him call me on a Saturday morning with the careful voice of a man delivering a diagnosis. Serena Voss had been married once before. Her previous husband, a man named Gary Ellison, was a 61-year-old widower and property owner in Asheville. They had married in 2015. In 2017, Gary Ellison had signed over the deed to his primary residence to a joint LLC that Serena had formed months earlier. In 2018, Gary filed for divorce. By the time the divorce was finalized, the LLC had been dissolved, and the property had been transferred again to a holding company with no visible connection to Serena, but which Roy had traced through 2 layers of incorporation to an address associated with her. Sista. Gary Ellison ended up with nothing. He was currently renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Fletcher, North Carolina, I called Gerald Pittman from my library that same afternoon and told him to begin documenting everything. The night it happened was a Thursday in February. Daniel and Serena had come for dinner, a dinner Serena had proposed, which I now understood differently. I had made pot roast, the way Margaret used to make it, because it was Daniel's favorite and because I was not yet ready to stop hoping. We ate in the dining room. Serena was charming in the way she always was, warm, attentive, asking me about a documentary she claimed to have watched about famous federal cases. After dinner, Daniel asked to talk. He and Serena sat on one side of my kitchen table. I sat on the other. The dynamic was not lost on me. Daniel laid out what he called a plan. He said that he and Serena had been working with a financial planner. I noted he did not name one, and they had determined that the most efficient arrangement would be for me to transfer the house into a family trust with Daniel as co-trustee. This would, he said, protect the asset and simplify the estate process when the time came. I asked him which attorney had drawn up this trust. He hesitated, Serena answered. She named a firm in Charlotte I had never heard of. I asked Daniel if he had spoken with Gerald Pittman about this. Another hesitation. Longer. I said quietly that I knew about the letter sent to Gerald's office. I said I knew about the address change at the bank. I said I knew about Gary Ellison and Fletcher. Serena's expression didn't shatter. That was the thing. It adjusted like a camera refocusing. She looked at Daniel, and something passed between them that I had not been meant to see. Daniel stood up from the table. What came next? I have turned over in my mind many times since. I've tried to find the version of events where it makes sense, where I can explain it as fear, or shame, or some desperate attempt to protect himself from what he knew was coming. I have not found that version. He told me I was paranoid. He said the death of his mother had clearly affected my judgment in ways that concerned him deeply. He said that if I was going to make wild accusations against his wife, then maybe it was time to have a serious conversation about whether I was still capable of making sound decisions on my own behalf. I looked at my son across my kitchen table and I said, very evenly, that I thought he should leave. He said I would regret treating them this way. Serena said nothing. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair with the deliberate calm of someone who had been through a version of this before. They walked toward the front door. I followed to see them out. At the threshold, Daniel stopped. He turned around, and the expression on his face was one I had genuinely never seen there before. Not anger, not shame, but something cold and calculated that did not belong to the boy I had raised. He said, "You can't stay in this house forever, old man. One way or another." Then he walked out. I stood in my open front door. It was February in North Carolina, which is not the brutal winter of the Midwest, but it was 28 degrees, and there was a thin, hard snow coming down that had started that afternoon. The wind moved through the door and across my face, and I stood there for probably 10 seconds before I realized I had followed them out onto the porch without my coat. I went back inside. I locked the door. What I did not know, what I could not have known at that moment, was that 40 minutes later I would be lying in that driveway. I am a man who does not embarrass easily. I will tell you plainly what happened. I went to my library and I sat in my chair, and something in me gave way, not broke, exactly, but released. I had been holding the shape of a father whose son was still reachable, and I had just been shown clearly that I was holding something that no longer existed. I sat in that chair for a while. I don't know exactly how long. At some point, I put on my coat and my boots because I needed air, because the house that had always felt like Margaret felt, in that moment, like it was pressing inward. I went out the front door and down the porch steps, and I was walking down the driveway, just walking, going nowhere, just needing the cold air in the dark, when my boot caught the edge of a patch of ice hidden under the snow near the base of the front slope. I went down hard, left hip, left elbow, the side of my head grazing the surface of the driveway. I lay there and I assessed myself with the trained stillness of a man who has been trained to assess things, and I understood quickly that something was wrong with my hip, not the dull ache of a bruise. The bright, specific pain of something structural. I could not get up. My phone was in my coat pocket. I had not turned on the porch light when I came out. The snow was coming down, and the nearest house was a quarter-mile away, and my son, who had been in my home 45 minutes earlier, was already in his car on the highway. I called 911. I told them my address, and I told them I was down in the driveway, and could not stand. My voice was steady. I was a federal prosecutor for 32 years. I was steady. The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. The paramedics were kind and competent and quick. At the hospital, they told me I had a hairline fracture of the left hip serious, but not the catastrophic break it could have been. They told me I was lucky. I told them I had been in worse situations, and they laughed because they thought I was joking. I was not in the hospital alone for long. My neighbor, a retired teacher named Constance Alderman, who had known Margaret for 20 years, arrived within an hour. She had seen the ambulance lights. She held my hand and did not say the things people usually say. I was grateful for that. The next morning, from my hospital bed, I called Gerald Pittman. I told him everything, the full account, including Roy Clifton's findings about Gary Ellison, the letter sent to his office, the attempt to change my bank address, the proposal at the kitchen table, and exactly what Daniel had said at my front door. Gerald listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always valued about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Walter, this is criminal conduct. You understand that?" I told him I understood it completely. Gerald contacted the FBI field office in Charlotte. Because of the forgery, the letter sent to his firm bearing my falsified signature and the crossing of financial institution lines with the bank address change, there was federal jurisdiction. A special agent named Patricia Huang was assigned to the case. What Agent Huang found over the following 6 weeks was more thorough than even I had anticipated. The attempt to forge my signature on the letter to Gerald's office was, it turned out, not the first time Serena had used that approach. In the Gary Ellison matter, similar documentation had been filed, documents that Gary, in the chaos of his divorce proceedings, had never formally investigated. Agent Huang contacted him. Gary Ellison, who was now 68 and retired, drove to Charlotte and sat across from Agent Huang and provided a statement that took most of a day to complete. There was also the matter of the brokerage account. Roy Clifton's initial investigation had flagged the access attempt, but had not been able to fully trace it. The FBI had different tools. What they found was that the access had originated from a device registered to an email account created 6 weeks after Serena and Daniel married, an account that had been used to research estate law, property transfer procedures, and specifically the process, an explanation, an 80 and the process for establishing power of attorney over a parent who could be demonstrated to have diminished capacity. That last part, diminished capacity, was the one that stayed with me, because I understood what it meant. It meant the conversation at the kitchen table had not been the plan. It had been the fallback. The plan had been to manufacture the appearance of a father losing his mind, and then to step into the resulting legal vacuum. 32 years as a federal prosecutor, and they had planned to build a case for my incompetence. I will not pretend I felt nothing about this. I felt a great deal. I sat with it, in the way a person has to sit with the specific grief of being betrayed by someone you raised from a child. The grief that doesn't announce itself all at once, but arrives in pieces at odd hours, when you're making coffee or walking your 3 miles in the morning. I let myself feel it, and then I let Gerald Pittman and Patricia Huang do their work. Daniel and Serena were arrested on a Tuesday morning in April. Gerald called me when it happened. I was in my library. The charges were significant: wire fraud, attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person, forgery of legal documents, and conspiracy. Because of Serena's prior conduct with Gary Ellison, which was now part of the documented pattern Agent Huang had built, the federal charges carried substantial weight. My son called me from the county jail that evening. I answered because I am his father, and I will answer his calls until I am no longer able to. He did not apologize. He asked me to help him with bail. I told him quietly that I could not do that. I told him that I loved him, that I had loved him every day of his life, and that what he had been part of doing was not something I was able to set aside. I told him I hoped he would find his way back to the person he had been, and that I genuinely meant that. He hung up without responding. The legal process took 14 months. Serena's prior conduct with Gary Ellison was introduced as pattern evidence under federal rules, and the jury found it compelling. Gary Ellison, who sat in the courtroom on the day of closing arguments with the dignity of a man who had waited 6 years for someone to take him seriously, did not speak publicly. He didn't need to. The documents spoke. Serena was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 16 years in federal prison. Daniel, and this is the part that is hardest to say, was convicted as well. The evidence showed that while Serena had been the architect, Daniel had not been a passive instrument. He had been a participant. He had known about the letter to Gerald's office. He had been in the conversations about the brokerage account access. He had, on the night he walked out of my house, said words to me that were later entered into evidence as part of the pattern of intimidation. The judge sentenced him to 12 years. I sat in that courtroom for the sentencing, and I did not feel what people might expect me to feel. I did not feel triumph. I felt the particular sorrow of a man who has prosecuted hundreds of cases and understands, more completely than most, what a sentence actually means in terms of human years. I felt the loss of the boy who asked me why the grass grew faster near the fence. I felt the strange suspended grief of loving someone and being unable to reach them through what they had become. I felt also a quiet and settled certainty that I had done the right thing. After the sentencing, I drove home to Concord. I stopped on the way at a grocery store, and I bought pot roast ingredients because it was a Thursday, and I felt like cooking. I drove down my road as the light was fading, and I turned into my driveway, the same slope where the ice had been, and I sat in my car for a moment before going inside. Constance Alderman was on her porch across the way, as she often is in the evenings. She waved. I waved back. Inside, the library was exactly as I had left it. The chair. The lamp Margaret chose. The shelves that Margaret always said held more books than any reasonable man needed. On my desk in a small frame was a photograph from 1994. Margaret and I standing in front of the house the week the construction was finished, squinting into the afternoon sun, her hand on my arm. I put the groceries away. I changed out of my courtroom clothes into something comfortable. I turned on the lamp in the library and I put on a record Coltrane, which Margaret never fully liked but tolerated with good humor, and I started cooking. I had walked 3 miles that morning. My hip, which took the better part of a year to fully heal, was strong. My financial accounts were intact. My house, the one Margaret had designed with the large windows and the wraparound porch, was mine. I am 73 years old. I still walk every morning. The Japanese maple along the south side of the house turned copper again last October, the way it always does, the way Margaret always waited for. I stood in the yard and looked at it for a long time. There are people who will ask me whether I have any regret about what happened to Daniel, whether I should have tried harder to reach him before it went as far as it went. I understand the question. I have asked it myself. Here is what I know. I reached for him every time I could. I answered his call from the jail. I have written him 2 letters since the sentencing not to relitigate anything, just to tell him I am his father and that will not change. He has not written back. That door remains open on my side. What I also know is this. The law exists because some things cannot be handled by hope alone. The law exists because there are people who will not stop until someone makes them stop. I spent 32 years understanding that, and I spent one terrible February night on my back in a driveway being reminded of it in a way I will not forget. I did not go quietly. I am grateful I did not. There is one more thing I want to say. For the people watching this who have been in that position, not my exact position, but the broader one. The one where you are the older person in the room, and someone who should love you has decided you are an inconvenience, an obstacle, a resource to be managed. The one where you can feel the walls narrowing and you start to wonder if your judgment can be trusted. Trust your judgment. Document everything. Tell your attorney what is happening. Tell someone outside the family. The people who call you paranoid are often the people who need you to believe you are. And keep the porch light on. That is my practical advice. Keep the porch light on. I am Walter Gaines. I am 73 years old. I am a retired federal prosecutor and a father and a widower and a man who walks 3 miles every morning past a Japanese maple that turns copper every October. I am still here. I did not expect to have to fight this hard to say that. But I am still here, and some days that is enough of a victory on its own.